The novel The Golden Ass, also called the Metamorphoses, is one of the most unique and entertaining pieces of writing to come out of ancient Rome. Between the comedy's shocking violence and mythological asides, the main character encounters or engages with magic on some level almost everywhere he goes. The author of this unusual work is Apuleius, a philosopher, mystic, and self-proclaimed scientist whose supernatural interests landed him on trial for suspected misuse of witchcraft. Apuleius' life and works are fascinating, and I'll be talking about him for the next few videos. Today we'll cover his life, the philosophical influences that shaped his thinking, and the mystical interests that ultimately got him in trouble. Next week, we'll look at his most famous work, The Golden Ass, and finally, in 2 weeks, we'll take a look at the speech he made defending himself against the charge of witchcraft. There's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Welcome to Hearth of Haemonia. My name is Kate. Today we are talking about Apuleius. Now, the life of Apuleius as we know it comes from very limited source material. In fact, it's almost all from his own writing. He was a very prolific writer. There's a number of works that we know he authored, some that we suspect he authored, and others that are attributed to him but probably were not written by him to begin with. He's a little bit of an enigma to us, so as I go through this video, I'm going to try to provide as much biographical info as we have. This video will primarily be about his intellectual life, his academic pursuits, the things that he was interested in based on what we have of his writings. Apuleius was born in North Africa, in a city called Madauros in Roman Numidia, so this is modern-day Algeria. And he was probably born around the year 124 CE, but again, that's not confirmed. Madauros was a Roman and Berber city that had been continuously occupied for centuries, but had only been under Roman control for a short while. So when Apuleius was living there, it was still a relatively new Roman outpost. The city was populated by all sorts of different people, notably a lot of Roman veterans from the Roman army, and a lot of Christians. This is true even more so after Apuleius' time, but even when Apuleius was there, this was a somewhat Christianized city. In fact, it later went on to become one of the centers for early Catholicism, and Augustine spent time there, so it was a religiously active place. So like many provincial Romans, Apuleius grew up in a religiously, culturally, linguistically diverse place. This gave him a very interesting perspective on life. And the culture was always changing. It was a fast-moving cultural dialogue that was happening there. And I do just want to point out, even though Apuleius was born in Africa, he was not what we would consider natively or ethnically African. He was a Roman whose family moved to North Africa. So he's not an African person per se, but he did grow up in Africa. By all accounts, Apuleius grew up in a wealthy family. He had access to education, and his easy access to funds did allow him to travel extensively throughout the empire, which he did. He lived and studied in places like Carthage, Athens, Rome, and he traveled in the Eastern Empire as well, where he learned about the newest religious and philosophical movements that were being born there. We also know that he was initiated into a number of mystery cults, including the Eleusinian mysteries. And as I've said before on this channel, mystery cults were not really mysterious at all. In fact, the Eleusinian Mysteries was so popular that at its height, pretty much all of the residents of Athens were initiated into the cult. But the rites themselves are supposed to be kept secret, and that's why they're called mystery cults. And Apuleius' mystery cult initiation had an impact on his writing. In the end of his novel, The Golden Ass, the main character gets initiated into the rites of Isis. Because of his education, Apuleius became a devoted philosopher, and he was evidently a pretty competent public speaker as well. He was primarily influenced by Plato and the Platonist movements. In antiquity, philosophy was a much broader category than it is today, so Apuleius wrote on all sorts of different topics, from biology to metaphysics, the nature of gods and the human soul, demonology, agriculture, all sorts of different topics. And he used this intellectual diversity of interests later on when he was accused of witchcraft, basically to say that he was just doing what any good naturalist or scientist would do with all of his experiments and peculiar behavior. More on that in a couple of weeks. Now, although Apuleius wrote primarily about serious topics, he's probably best remembered for his satirical novel, The Golden Ass, in which the main character gets turned into a donkey and goes on all sorts of adventures. Sometime in his 30s, Apuleius became involved with a wealthy woman named Pudentilla, and they ended up getting married. This led to Apuleius being brought up on charges of witchcraft, because, as his accusers suggested, he allegedly bewitched this woman into falling in love with him for the purposes of basically getting her inheritance when she died. She was a lot older than him, evidently. Apuleius defended himself against this charge, and we'll take a look at his defense speech, as I said, in a couple of weeks, because it's really interesting, and there's all sorts of, little magical tidbits in there that I think are really interesting. We don't know when Apuleius died. It was probably sometime after 170, when he was in his mid-40s. He leaves behind all sorts of works that are either rightly or wrongfully attributed to him on a variety of topics. For now, though, I want to take a look at the philosophical world that Apuleius lived in, which he contributed to. The first word of the treatise De Deo Socrates is Plato. This treatise is probably a work of Apuleius, and right from the bat we can see the influence that Plato had on not just Apuleius, but on all philosophers for centuries and centuries after he lived. It's hard to overstate how influential Plato's writing was. Now, Plato lived in the 5th century in Athens, and he wrote dialogues, most of them featuring his teacher and one of the most famous ancient philosophers, Socrates. And he wrote a number of other treatises on how government should work, on laws, and all sorts of things like that. And as I was saying, philosophy extended pretty far out from what we might think of it as today. So he also wrote on things like physics, how mirrors worked, light particles, and stuff like that. His thinking and writing guided this philosophical school that was called the Academy, which he founded. And as the centuries went on, different philosophers, different groups of philosophers, different schools interpreted and used Plato's work in various ways. Apuleius belonged to a school of thought that we call the Second Sophistic. And basically the Second Sophistic, as you might imagine, comes from the First Sophistic, or the Sophists. The Sophists were actually contemporaries of Plato. They had similar aims as Plato did, teaching about the nature of truth in the universe and all of that. But the Sophists basically valued making a convincing argument much higher than Plato did. Plato was interested in absolute truth. The Sophists were interested in constructing a good argument, so they put a lot of attention into rhetorical technique and stuff like that. Plato doesn't speak too highly of them in his writing because he thinks that they're a bunch of crackpots that are just ripping people off and getting paid for making nonsensical arguments. But evidently their influence lasted, and the Second Sophistic was the movement that Apuleius was a part of. As I said, he was a competent speaker, and his rhetorical prowess helped him defend himself against charges of witchcraft. The Second Sophistic really did try to revive this interest in rhetorical technique and how to construct an argument, how to convince people that you're right. These were all things that the Second Sophistic was interested in, but with a basis, with a philosophical basis in Plato. And much like Plato, Apuleius wrote on a number of different topics, and you can see in his works the diversity of interests that he had. So he was much like his philosophical predecessors and his, idol Plato, where he was looking for a sort of well-rounded impression of the world. So that's the philosophical world that Apuleius was a part of, reinterpreting Plato and using it to construct a good argument and a good story. And Apuleius was a pretty good storyteller. He's most famous, like I said, for his work, The Golden Ass. And it is unique in that it is the only full, intact novel that we have from antiquity. We have others that are mostly complete or partially complete, others that are just referenced, but this one we have in full. How lucky for us, and how lucky for me that it's all about magic. Yay. So I will go through this work in detail next week, but for now I'll just give you a plot summary. This guy named Lucius comes to Thessaly. He finds himself in Thessaly, which is where all of the witches live. That's like a well-known trope. And he discovers that there's all this magic around. And he becomes fascinated by it. He's so curious about how magic works, and he really wants to try it out for himself. When he gets the opportunity to do so, he takes it, but he's not a trained magician. Things go wrong, and he accidentally turns himself into a donkey. It's delightful, I'm telling you, it's great. And as a donkey, he goes on all these adventures, most of them unpleasant for him. He has to carry a bunch of stuff. He works in a mill where he just has to move the millstone around. He gets in with a band of robbers who treat him very unfairly. But as a donkey, he hears things that maybe he wouldn't have heard if he was a human. So it's sort of like a window into the secret parts of people's lives. It's episodic, it's funny, it's satirical, and it's filled top to bottom with magic. Apuleius' other most famous work is his Apologia, which is not the word apology. This is the word for a defense speech. As I've been hinting at, Apuleius gets accused of bewitching his wife into falling in love with him, and he's put on trial and he defends himself with this speech. And as he goes through, he talks about all of the different accusations of magic that are brought against him, and he systematically disproves each one in what he believes to be a sufficiently convincing argument. Apuleius is one of those people who you hear about his life and his interests, and it really demonstrates the sort of nebulous, porous line between magic and religion, philosophy, science, all of these disciplines that we consider to be distinct. In someone like Apuleius, you have an intellectual who's interested in all of them at once. And in antiquity, they really would not have been considered separate disciplines. Apuleius was interested in things like biology and math, but he also was initiated into mystery cults that promised immortality and access to truths about the universe. Yet when you read his most famous writing, it's about smearing magical ointment on yourself to turn into an animal. His intellectual life may feel like a paradox by today's standards, but he was right in line with the intellectual classes of his day. So today's video is a little bit short, but I did want to give a brief introduction to Apuleius before I dive into his famous works in the next 2 weeks. So I hope that you found this helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you don't want to miss the next 2 episodes about Apuleius, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be posting them next week and the week after. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next video.